Students, and welcome to my online lecture. For this online lecture, we'll be covering chapter 5, and in this chapter, we're going to take a look at the inquiry question: did the Japanese occupation change the way people viewed Singapore? Okay, there will be 3 parts to this lecture, and I will start with part 1. For part 1, we'll be taking a look at how people viewed what were people's views towards Singapore before the Japanese occupation. Okay, so we want to take a look at what were their thoughts on Singapore before the Japanese invaded Singapore. So Singapore as home. Now, not everybody had the same view of Singapore. Immigrants and local born people had different views. Immigrants did not intend to stay here permanently, while the local born people considered Singapore as their home. Now let's take a look at some examples of the views of immigrants towards Singapore. Okay, one such immigrant was Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Now we're going to take a look at some of the things that the immigrants in Singapore did. Now, this guy on the left is called Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Now, he's actually is based in China. Okay, he wanted to remove the Qing government in China as he felt that it was causing China to become backward. So, in order to do so, he started the Chinese Revolutionary Movement, which looked for support from the overseas Chinese people. The Chinese in Singapore contributed money, and some even returned to China to fight against the Qing government. Now, when the Qing government was overthrown in 1911, Chinese men in Singapore showed support by cutting off their queues, which is their unique pigtails that they have, long pigtails that they have for their hair. Now, let's take a look at another personality. The person on the left is Gandhi. I think it's quite familiar to many people. Now, Mahatma Gandhi wanted to gain independence from India, from the British, because during that point of time, India was a colony, it was a British colony, and he influenced Indian immigrants in Singapore to support him. In fact, he actually influenced Indians all over the world. Now, Indians in Singapore formed the Indian Youth League, which showed him support by celebrating Gandhi's birthday and by holding plays in his honor. So here we see 2 examples of how immigrants in Singapore viewed Singapore. Okay, they were very much patriotic and loved their home country. Now let's take a look at the views of local-born people towards Singapore. Now, the locals considered Singapore as their permanent home because Singapore was where their friends and family were. Some attended English medium schools, became westernized, and were very proud of being British subjects. They were able to work in British colonial service, which is like in today's modern terms, it's called the civil service, the government civil service, because of their English education. Okay, so these were the English educated locals. Okay, now moving on, British as rulers of Singapore. Now, the British believed that they were superior to Asians and it was their responsibility to make Asians more civilized. Okay, now they believed that Asians were not civilized and were a bit barbaric, and it was their job to make us Asians more civilized. There was little local involvement in the government, which was made up mainly of the British people. Even the well-qualified local people who had a good education were also not given important positions in the government. Now, the locals had little say in the government's policies, which means the things that the government does, okay, for the country. Europeans were given privileged treatment, and Because of that, some locals were unhappy with the unequal system and tried to negotiate for more local involvement in the government. Over here we see a cartoon, okay, of how the Western powers see themselves. Right? The European powers see themselves. So as you can see, these are the Asians, and this is them trying to bring them to civilization. Now we've reached the last section, which is Singapore as an impregnable fortress. In the 1930s, Japan became increasingly aggressive and looked for raw materials in the Dutch East Indies. Singapore was attractive to the Japanese as it would enable Japan to launch attacks on the Dutch East Indies, which is the region around Indonesia. Now, Japan wanted to conquer Southeast Asia because it had a lot of raw materials such as rubber and tin. Chinese immigrants reacted to Japan's invasion of China by boycotting, which means they do not buy Japanese goods, and by attacking any Japanese that they see in Singapore. Britain recognized that Japan was a threat and began building a large naval base in Singapore. The British also installed big guns around the coast of Singapore to protect it against an invasion by sea. People believed that Singapore was safe as it was protected by the British, who were known for their naval power. Okay, they were known to have the strongest navy in the world at that point of time. So you can't find this in Singapore. In fact, this is the idea of a fortress. Okay, a place which is very difficult to attack because of its good defenses. All right, with that, we have come to an end for part 1. Thank you.